Apart from genetics, the biggest determinant of long-term muscle growth is training consistency. Training adequately for many years consistently will usually produce superior results compared with a perfect training routine performed for a short duration. However, many people end up being inconsistent or completely stop training altogether after a fairly short time. So how do we stay consistent with our training for multiple years consecutively? First, let's discuss how adherent people typically are to resistance training. This study explored the levels of adherence to resistance training over a 2-year time period. 164 untrained women between the ages of 25 to 44 years were provided with a 2-year gym membership at a local YWCA. In the first 4 months, subjects were provided with small group personal training sessions 2 times per week. For the remainder of the 2-year membership, subjects were encouraged to continue their training routines. This was also supplemented by small group personal training sessions every 12 weeks for social support, and a one-on-one personal training session each month to individualize, adjust, and apply progressive overload to the training routine. It was found that in the initial 4-month supervised period, adherence to the training program was 95% of total sessions completed. However, after being left to their own devices, adherence dropped to 65% after the first year and to 51% at the end of the 2 years. Ideally, we would want lifters to stay consistent with their training routine in some capacity for the rest of their lives, for both muscle growth and long-term health. So the first strategy to maximize our chances of doing so is to understand our training goals. For the purpose of this video, we will be focusing on body composition goals, not strength or performance goals. But even within the realm of body composition, what are you trying to get out of training? Are you trying to be the world's best competitive bodybuilder, or are you trying to simply improve body composition for general health? The reason it is important to understand your training goals is so that you can adjust your training accordingly. Or maybe you are following a routine which is designed for something which isn't really representative of your individual goals. This might take more time and effort than you are feasibly able to perform long term and end up failing to adhere to the routine. Or if you were constantly pushing for something that isn't relevant, you might end up not seeing the purpose of what you were doing and stop training altogether. And once you know the direction you want to head in, the next consideration is how you go about achieving your goals. Since muscle growth is a long and slow process, we will probably see better long-term adherence by adopting a more process-oriented goal mindset, as opposed to an outcome goal mindset. Process goals are those which focus on the behaviors required to achieve the outcome, whereas outcome goals are those which focus directly on the end result. For example, process goals might be, I aim to go to the gym 4 times per week, or I aim to include a decent protein serving each meal. Whereas outcome goals might be, I want to gain 3 kilos of muscle in the next 6 months, or I want to lose 5 kilos by the end of the year. And according to this research review, adopting a process focus is generally associated with greater well-being and adherence to a task, including exercise. This can help us stay consistent with our training over time and likely lead to superior long-term body composition results. And the more we adopt these process-oriented behaviors, the more of a habit it will generally become. Habits allow us to essentially work in autopilot mode, where it takes less psychological effort to complete a task, which in this case is exercise. The less of a regular habit exercise is, the more willpower that is required. Some people have stronger willpower than others, but nobody has infinite willpower. So relying solely on willpower to exercise will probably result in a failure to adhere to training at some point. So for the most part, we want to rely mostly on habit formation to help us stay consistent with training. Willpower might be used slightly more in some situations, but shouldn't be relied upon for long-term consistency. For example, it will probably take a little more willpower to initially get started with lifting, but the longer you lift, the more of a habit it will become. Now let's get into a little more detail about training. Essentially, there is likely to be diminishing returns when it comes to the total training stimulus we provide. Finding the quote-unquote optimal routine may result in a slightly faster rate of muscle growth, but probably isn't significantly better than performing an adequate training routine. And the downside is that performing an optimal routine may take significantly more time and effort for very little additional benefit. What we mean by adequate training is to ensure we are at least meeting the minimum requirements to elicit a muscle growth adaptation. Anything beyond this threshold might be superior, but it is just the rate of growth that will change. To ensure our training is adequate, it is most important to ensure we are training with the following considerations. A sufficient proximity to failure, at least around 3 reps in reserve for the most part. Sufficient volume. For most people, a minimum of around 8 sets per muscle group per week is usually required to achieve long-term growth. Appropriate lifting technique, ensuring the target muscle is the limiter of each set. And the application of progressive overload. Ensure load or reps are gradually increasing over time based on your individual rate of progression. However, if you were training fairly close to failure, you will naturally be implementing progressive overload anyway. Other variables can also have an influence on muscle growth, but probably aren't as important. Factors such as the exact exercises we select, frequency, exact rep ranges, exact rest periods, etc. are all less important in the big picture. And in some cases, obsessing over the minute details of certain variables may cause more decision fatigue and anxiety than the benefit it will provide. And we obviously want to minimize any barriers to exercise for long-term adherence. So focus most of your attention on the most important variables and don't stress too much about the less important ones. For a more detailed analysis of what the most and least important factors for muscle growth are, check out the video in the description. This also relates to how we set up our training routine as a whole. There are infinite ways to program and prescribe lifting, and the degree of rigidity we implement into our program can influence our adherence. This can be seen on a spectrum, where we have more flexibility on one side and more rigidity on the other. Maximum flexibility would mean prescribing nothing at all. You can go into the gym as many days as you like, perform whatever exercises you like, and as many sets as you like, etc. Whereas maximal rigidity means prescribing all variables very specifically, such as planning what days you train, what exercises you perform, specific rep targets, exact rest periods, proximity to failure prescription, etc. For the most part, it generally helps to have a training structure in place. We probably at the least want to have a set number of days per week that we exercise, the specific exercises or movement patterns we want to train each session, and how many sets of each exercise we perform. The other variables might be prescribed more or less rigidly depending on the individual. However, being too rigid at all times can sometimes inhibit adherence in some cases. This is because other important things in our life can sometimes take a priority over lifting, such as work or family. So a little more flexibility can sometimes help us work around this and keep us adherent to the training protocol. For example, a novice who has lots of time to train may want a little more rigidity with their training routine. This might help them stay adherent as it minimizes decision making. Whereas an experienced lifter who has full-time work and family responsibilities might adopt a slightly more flexible approach to work around the rest of their busy life. And since they have already developed consistent habits, this approach may make it easier to stick with the training routine long-term. The next factor to consider for long-term consistency is systemic fatigue. This isn't a well-defined term, but it can generally be described as global fatigue affecting the central systems of the body. This can sort of be thought of as a lifter's version of short-term overtraining, and excessive systemic fatigue can have some symptoms for lifters, which are also similar to those seen with overtraining syndrome. This was reported in this study, which took survey data from 605 athletes who had experienced some form of training maladaptation, all of which included resistance training as a primary component of their training. The most commonly reported symptoms among athletes included general feelings of fatigue, musculoskeletal aches and pains, decreased motivation, lethargy, poor sleep quality, reduced concentration, and so on. Despite this, there is currently no direct evidence that I am aware of to show that excessive systemic fatigue inhibits muscle growth directly, although it can certainly hinder our ability to stay adherent to a training routine. If we are feeling some of these symptoms, we are going to have more resistance to perform each workout. And if too much willpower is required to train, we have a higher likelihood of skipping sessions or just completely stop training altogether. While we want to avoid excessive systemic fatigue, some is unavoidable. And this is okay, as long as it isn't excessive and causing some of the issues we mentioned. A strategy that can be helpful to minimize the risk of this is to consider the stimulus to fatigue ratio, a concept developed by Dr. Mike Israetel from Renaissance Periodization. This is the idea that every exercise and the technique we use produces somewhat of a hypertrophic stimulus, but also has a systemic fatigue cost. So we essentially want to provide the best hypertrophic stimulus possible with minimal systemic fatigue. The stimulus will be influenced by factors such as which muscle is the limiter of the set, the range of motion the target muscle is trained through, lifting tempo, the resistance profile of the exercise, and so on. While systemic fatigue will be influenced by factors such as the total amount of musculature involved in the exercise, the cardiorespiratory demands of the exercise, the technical requirements of the lift, psychological arousal, the absolute load lifted, and so on. While there are no strict rules as to what the best exercises to implement are, or what the best technique is to use, here are a few tips to help us train with a more favourable stimulus to fatigue ratio. Keep technique strict, ensuring the target muscle is the limiter of each set. Train with a full range of motion, or at least include the lengthened range of the exercise. Use a controlled eccentric tempo and minimize involvement of the stretch shortening cycle. Prioritize lifting technique over load. Prioritize exercises which require less psychological arousal and technical difficulty. And avoid training with too many heavy compound barbell lifts which require lots of stability and bracing. Following on from the systemic fatigue discussion, the next factor to consider is arousal. Most tasks have an inverted U-shaped relationship with arousal and performance. Some arousal can benefit performance, but too much can inhibit performance, and this graph looks different for different tasks. For maximal strength, we usually benefit from higher levels of arousal. However, hypertrophy probably benefits from more moderate levels. This is because we aren't necessarily trying to lift the most amount of weight possible, since it isn't a performance goal. Instead, we are trying to maximally stress the target muscle to induce a structural adaptation. So I think that slightly lower arousal levels can be beneficial for two specific reasons. First is to help produce the best hypertrophic stimulus possible. Being too psyched up can sometimes take attention away from the sensations while lifting. This includes factors such as the mind-muscle connection, stretch under load, muscle pump, etc. Although these aren't directly correlated with muscle growth, they can be helpful to inform technique and exercise execution during the session. And second is to minimize systemic fatigue. If we have high levels of arousal every time we work out, we are just adding additional psychological stress, which can contribute to systemic fatigue. And as we have mentioned, excessive systemic fatigue can inhibit our adherence to the training plan. Here are a few strategies to help us regulate arousal at appropriate levels for a hypertrophy workout. First is the narrative we tell ourselves about what we are doing in the gym and why we are lifting in the first place. If we adopt the narrative that performing a resistance training workout is like going to war, we are probably going to increase our arousal beyond helpful levels. Whereas if we can take the entire process into perspective with a calm and rational mindset, we are probably going to be in a more appropriate zone for what we are trying to accomplish. So the point here is that the mentality we take into the gym can influence our psychological arousal. If we always have the mindset that we are going into battle every workout, this can contribute to fatigue and eventually burn us out over time. But a more composed mindset is probably going to be a slightly more sustainable long-term behavior that we can continue for many years. And another factor which can contribute to arousal is caffeine intake. This study explored the effects of different levels of caffeine intake on different mood states. 13 Division I college fencers were provided with a caffeine drink before a fencing training session consisting of either 0, 1.5, 3, 4.5, 6, or 7.5 milligrams per kilogram of body weight on separate training days in a random order. To put these numbers into perspective, these doses are equivalent to around 0, 1.1, 2.3, 3.4, 4.5 and 5.6 standard coffees for a 75 kilogram individual. It was found that more caffeine resulted in greater arousal, decreased tiredness, increased tension, and decreased calmness during the athlete's training sessions. So a little caffeine might help us concentrate and focus in the gym, especially if we are particularly tired that day. However, high caffeine doses might increase arousal and decrease calmness to a detrimental extent, contributing to greater systemic fatigue. And the other strategy is the music we decide to listen to while lifting, if we like to listen to music at all. The music we listen to can influence our mood states and how we approach a workout. Some music can increase arousal and some can decrease it. And we can use this to help regulate our arousal levels to be in the optimal zone for our workout. A little motivational music can sometimes be helpful for a little boost in arousal if needed. However, you don't want to always try and play the most motivational music, as this might unnecessarily increase psychological fatigue. And if you are already feeling stressed from events outside the gym, it might be useful to listen to calming music to help focus without the extra psychological fatigue. The last and potentially most important factor which can influence long-term training consistency is your expectations and comparing results to others. Generally, we have some sort of expectation of what we want to achieve within a specific time frame. And in most cases, I would say people's expectations are a little unrealistic. This is often because we are comparing ourselves to other people we know or other people we see online, usually those who have a well above average response to training. And there is no problem with admiring others or being inspired by them. However, the reality is that your response to a training intervention is outside your control, and the variability between how people respond to training is very large. This was seen in this study, which compared the variability in muscle growth between individuals following the same training protocol. 585 young and healthy untrained men and women performed 3 sets of preacher curls, concentration curls, and standing dumbbell curls for 12 weeks. Energy balance was somewhat controlled too, by excluding any subjects who lost significant body weight throughout the duration of the study, as this may have had a detrimental effect on muscle growth. While all subjects had no resistance training history and performed the same training routine, there was significant variability in biceps growth between subjects. Most subjects saw around a 10 to 20% increase in cross-sectional area. However, a small number saw a greater than 50% increase, and others saw no gains and even a slight regression. So while there are certainly ways in which we can maximize our rate of muscle growth, our genetic response to a training intervention is outside our control. Some people are more or less responsive to training than others. So if we compare our results to someone else's, it doesn't really help in any way. And most likely, it will be more discouraging for our own journeys. So while it is great to listen to other people's experience and advice, it is not advised to expect the same outcomes as someone else. You will probably be more consistent with training long term if you just focus on your own journey, and chances are that you will eventually achieve pretty good results if you stick with it long enough. Taking all this information, let's establish some practical recommendations. Apart from our genetic response to training, the length of time we spend lifting consistently with a sufficient stimulus is probably the most predictive factor for long-term muscle growth. To stay adherent and consistent with your training, there are a number of things we can do to maximize our chances. First is to establish the overall purpose of why you were lifting in the first place, and ensuring that how you were training aligns with that purpose. It is also helpful to adopt a process-oriented mindset towards your goals rather than an outcome-oriented mindset. Second is to develop and rely mostly on habit formation to complete your workouts, as opposed to using willpower. Next is to ensure you are focusing most of your attention to the fundamental concepts of hypertrophy training, such as training with sufficient volume, intensity, good lifting technique, and applying progressive overload. And don't stress too much about the other nuances of training that are less impactful. To do so, you probably want to have a solid lifting routine in place, but it doesn't have to be too rigidly prescribed if your lifestyle doesn't allow for it. Instead, you can be a little more flexible as long as you are taking care of the fundamental components that we just mentioned. We also want to avoid excessive systemic fatigue, which can decrease our motivation to train and increase the risk of burnout. An important concept to help manage this is by considering the stimulus to fatigue ratio of how we train. Furthermore, psychological arousal plays a role in contributing to systemic fatigue. Some level of arousal is probably beneficial, but excessive arousal can potentially inhibit the stimulus we provide and increase the systemic fatigue cost of training. Some strategies to help regulate arousal appropriately are to zoom out and take a big picture look at the narrative you tell yourself while lifting. Low doses of caffeine can help boost arousal to effective levels, but high doses will probably increase arousal beyond what is beneficial for the purposes of hypertrophy training. And we can also use music to help calm our mood down or boost our arousal slightly if needed. And lastly, we should understand that every individual will respond differently to resistance training. It can be demotivating to set unrealistic expectations or to compare yourself to others. So it is probably going to be more helpful to focus on your own journey for long-term adherence to lifting. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.